And here comes Bonnie with she wants me to do a very critical thing, which I have to do off camera. Hello, everybody. We have 2 reactions already. Hi, Stevie. I see you out there. Stevie is among our most active people in sharing videos and in doing a number of other very, very important things.
Thank you.
For our group.
Yep.
Shall I?
No, I'll keep trying.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Okay, thanks, honey. Okay, so let's see. Hi, everybody.
Good evening.
And we have a comment. Who's the comment from? It's Russell Gallman. Hi, Russell. How are you? And Rob says, hello, Yoda. Well, which of us are you referring to this time, Rob?
Hello, Rob.
And Mark Fabian is welcoming you back.
Okay.
Robin Halsey says, good evening.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, we'll wait a moment longer. Okay, let's get started, I think. Okay, so we've convened this tonight specifically to talk about your foreign policy agenda.
Yeah.
And the reason why we did this is because there isn't really a lot of information on your website about that.
True.
And about people don't, really know about it. And inquiring minds want to know. I'm sure you remember that being from New York. Okay, which I am also, by the way. I'm from the Bronx, if I haven't said so before.
Well, that's where my parents came from.
I'm from the Pelham Parkway area,
Yeah.
specifically.
Yeah.
Okay, so your foreign policy agenda then. Would you like to give us an introduction to it?
Well, I think that one has to keep in mind the general situation of international relations. Namely, we're in a situation where we have a plurality of independent states. Needless to say, the independence of states is something real, but obviously it varies in terms of their strength militarily, economically, culturally. And one thinks about how international law is often formulated according to the principle that essentially it boils down to treaties should be observed. And we have international organizations such as League of Nations or United Nations that seem to be founded on the principle that nations should relate to one another in terms of basically a principle of non-interference, and one should repel aggression, but otherwise not play any positive role in the affairs of other states. It is not invited. And when you see international organizations like a League of Nations or United Nations set up, the member states belong under the presumption that they're not going to be subject to meddling of the other members. That the principle of essentially non-interference is to reign supreme. And some people regard that as being the ultimate situation of the relations of states, that one can almost model it on the relation of individuals. So just as we might, at least in terms of classical liberal theory, think of persons as being in effect equal from a normative point of view, and thereby such that they should respect one another's liberty. There's a thought that one should apply that same principle to international affairs, but there's one fundamental disanalogy, and that's that if one regards any kind of institutional relationship or arrangement as having any normative character, so that one can distinguish between good and bad regimes, states do not stand in the same relation as individuals who might be regarded as, let's say, free and equal, and not having any fundamental hierarchy in terms of merit. States are of a different sort. There's some that could be considered fundamentally more legitimate than others from the point of view of the justice of their institutions and the like. So this then puts international relations in a somewhat different situation. And then by the same token, if one considers international principles of economic justice and the like, and how one might regard every individual as in some respect a citizen of the world and entitled to equal opportunities, then the question enters in of to what degree should nations be sharing their wealth, and to what degree should there be a redistribution of wealth among nations. But all of these questions have to contend with the fact that nations are independent, and that means that any of these redistributive matters have to put up with the fact that one doesn't have any direct control over what individual states do with whatever may or may not be given to them in various ways. Of course, the United States is in a very distinct position because, on the one hand, we are the largest economy in the world. We also subscribe to a certain kind of normative project. We look upon ourselves as if we were a bastion of freedom. We have armed ourselves to a greater degree than any other nation. Our military budget is larger than the size of the military budgets of the next 8 nations who have the largest military budgets in the world. So, for better or worse, that puts us in a different situation, and that because we've given ourselves these vast military resources that are spread all over the world, we find ourselves with certain kinds of obligations that other nations don't have. Because you can't expect Sierra Leone to come to the rescue of peoples who were subject, let's say, to massacres of various sorts. But because they simply don't have the means to have any effective play, but precisely because we have such a gigantic military endowments, we, in some respect, have certain kinds of responsibilities that other nations do not have. And in a way, we have to contend with that and decide how we're going to be operating this
how well do you think
military power we have?
How well do you think that we are meeting those responsibilities?
Well, I think we are doing so in a very uneven way, really. Of course, we can debate whether we should even have such a large military. Obviously, much of our military, first of all, involves huge expenditures for types of arms systems that, in a way, are completely, you could say, obsolete. In the sense, we have this huge infrastructure that is made for a world that had the kind of opposition of superpowers that no longer exists. We're still supporting all of these weapon systems that have no military purpose. On the other hand, we have a huge nuclear armament that really puts the planet in jeopardy. And of course, huge expenditures have been initiated under Obama, and Trump wants to raise them. as well with regard to modernizing our nuclear armaments. And the very fact that we have a button at all where a president can, in some respect, unilaterally put a kind of nuclear holocaust upon the world seems to be something that is not inevitable, something that we could eliminate. And in a way, we could eliminate it by trying to pursue some radical disarmament with regard to nuclear weapons. And we certainly could do so with regard to the other nuclear superpower, Russia. I mean, there's no reason why we and Russia could not drastically reduce the number of our nuclear armaments to the point where no one needs to have a button. There would be no need to have that kind of instantaneous response, because no side would have the kind of weapons that could really carry out the kind of first strike that would make any kind of reply impossible. And I think we want to accomplish a kind of disarmament to the extent that would eliminate that kind of situation. So I think if we want to, one important part of foreign policy, I think, should be to engage in a initially partial nuclear disarmament to a sufficient degree that the chance of a nuclear holocaust is eliminated entirely, and to do this with regard to the other nuclear powers, to bring down the numbers to a great degree. Also,
okay, is that something that you would be pursuing in Congress and that you would try to get others to support?
I mean, certainly to the extent that, you know, we have a role to play in voting on defense appropriations. And of course, many of the defense appropriations involve, you know, committing vast resources to maintaining and, to some degree, if you want to follow Trump, enlarging our nuclear armaments or modernizing our nuclear armaments. And I think, you know, this remains a major problem that we've, you know, sort of forgotten about. But I think that, you know, if you take, for example, this recent book that Daniel Ellsberg came out with, which I haven't read, but I've read reports and reviews about it, you know, where he was actually working for the RAND Corporation and the Defense Department, you know, came upon the way in which nuclear planning was and control mechanisms were organized. And it was quite obvious that all sorts of people could unilaterally unleash vastly destructive nuclear forces, which
yes,
have no military purpose. They're weapons of terror, and only can be weapons of terror. Weapons,
right. And we came close to having accidents a few times, didn't we?
Yeah, and of course the Cuban Missile Crisis was a catastrophe. I think. I mean, it was, you know, there's no excuse for Kennedy to have put us into that state of risk. It's, I think, kind of inexcusable. And I think one of the real black eyes of his presidency, that we came so close to the brink.
Well, what kinds of actions?
I want to eliminate that possibility. And I think one way of doing it is to try to, for example, drastically restrict the funding for refurbishing nuclear weapons and for eliminating them to a great degree. You know, I don't think
that's a policy. That's a policy you would pursue in Congress.
Yeah, I think I think that's one prime policy. I think we can no longer ignore the need to advance towards very major cuts in nuclear arms. First and foremost, between the United States and Russia, which vastly exceed the armaments of any other nation with regard to nuclear weapons. And then I think we have to think about, on that basis, we can have the kind of moral example that would make a more aggressive non-proliferation policy possible.
What would you do about that aspect of our foreign policy that has been slowly, and now not so slowly, peeling back the buffer zone in Eastern Europe between the Western powers and the Russians? We now have our forces really very close to the very borders, okay, of Russia.
Yeah. You mean with the expansion of NATO and the absorption of former territories of the Soviet Union into
Yeah, right. And also the foreign policy moves in the in terms of overturning the situation in the Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and manipulating that country into a situation where it would become a part of the Western Bloc and be right up on the borders of Russia in that circumstance, with a huge border with Russia.
Yeah.
What could we do to de-escalate that particular situation?
I mean, I think, irrespective of what we think about the internal situation of Russia, or certainly the prospects of democratization have not come to the fruition we might have hoped for. But nevertheless, I think
right, in part because of the nature of the intervention that we undertook in Russia itself during the early 90s, okay, and most of the 1990s. Subjecting Russia to a harsh kind of neoliberal regime
Sure.
certainly created a fertile situation for the rise of Putin.
Yep.
It formed the backdrop for his rise. So in many ways, we are to blame for his rise to power.
But I think, we have no excuse to allow our relationship to Russia to involve any possibility of nuclear conflict. We really, irrespective of any other issues, we really need to negotiate very, very substantial cuts in nuclear weapons, and also make it very, very clear that we are not going to be a military threat to Russia. Because any kind of military confrontation with Russia risks going nuclear, whether we like it or not, until we really drastically reduce these incredible hordes of nuclear weapons that we have. And I think we can do it. I think we can do it unilaterally to a large extent. We could have very, very substantial cuts of our own, and then negotiate further cuts. And there's no reason why we need to have more nuclear weapons in China or India or Pakistan. Right? And I think we can reduce our levels to something comparable, and then begin negotiating with other nations to bring it down. And I think if we really wanted to deal with situations like North Korea, I think there is a certain deal that could be made. I think it's a deal that has not been put forward, as far as I know, by any leaders in the United States. But I think the real deal that could be made is to offer North Korea, in exchange for nuclear disarmament, the withdrawal of all American forces from the Korean Peninsula, the negotiation of a peace treaty. I think this is the one thing that would allow the North Korean regime to agree to nuclear disarmament. I think China obviously would support it. What do we need armed forces in Korea? 60, almost 70 years after the Korean War came to its inconclusive
right, and in a situation where South Korea has a very strong economy, and is perfectly capable of defending itself, if need be.
Yeah. So I think we do want the North Koreans not to have nuclear weapons, but I think the only way that they're going to give them up is if we give them the kind of security that they're not going to be overthrown by military intervention,
yes,
which would only be done by the United States. Certainly South Korea is not in a position to do it. And if we offered this kind of deal, I think that is the one deal that could be feasible. And I don't think it's something where we have to worry about the rise of China or anything. I don't think our troops in Korea have anything to do with that dynamic in any realistic way. And of course, the future of China is a very important thing for the world. And in a way, one could say that the democratization of China will be perhaps the most important political development of the coming century, if it happens.
Yes, and that would probably never happen if we subject them to continued military pressure and to the kind of increasing military pressure that we're placing on them now.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the encirclement of China all about? Why are we embarking on it and continuing to accelerate it?
I mean, I think we have to realize that the balance of power in the world is changing, and it's going to change to a large degree because both India and China are, well, I wouldn't say there's any guarantee of it, but I would expect that they are going to become more and more affluent. And that's going to mean that their economies are going to become the two largest economies in the world.
Yes, and there's not very much that we can do about that, or that we probably ought to do about it.
Yeah. And the only thing that would prevent that we would end up growing our population through huge immigration in a way which would allow us to keep pace, and somehow our standard of living, our productivity, our production of wealth would be something that would keep pace with what they are going to be achieving, if it's possible. Of course, there are all sorts of questions here, one of which has to do with what is going to happen to the world environment and their environments in these nations. I think one of the important things regarding the question of global warming is what are we going to do internationally to help nations such as China and India to make a transition to green energy as they become more and more affluent and require more and more energy. Because
maybe the best thing we could do to help them is to get out of their way.
Well, I think we can take even more positive steps. I think we and other affluent nations in the world should make it as affordable as possible for them to get away from carbon-based energy expansion.
Right, but they are taking their own measures to get away from carbon-based expansion.
And to some extent, both countries are, and in a sense, they're facing their own ecological catastrophes, which are really making it something very immediate for all of them.
Yes, but it seems as though right now the Chinese are far more aggressive than the United States in getting into solar power.
Yeah.
In particular, and wind power.
And India is doing a surprising amount of things in this line.
Yes, I know. I know. I was reading an article about that earlier today in terms of the progress that India expects even by 2020 and 2024, and so on. They really are making great advances, while at the time our own progress in the area is being really crunched down by Mr. Trump, who thinks that he can sell fossil fuels to the world. I mean, I don't know why I'm sitting here laughing at this. It's not. It's really no joke at all.
Yeah. I think a very important part of our international relations has to do with policies regarding global warming.
Yes, I think so too.
Because, we're at a point where some very decisive decisions need to be made if more and more costly climate changes are going to be prevented.
And it seems as though Trump is making decisions in the other direction than they need to be made. Which means that not only have we been digging a hole for ourselves, but we're digging even faster.
I mean, we of course have been the world's greatest polluters and greatest source of CO2 emissions. Now we're beginning to be eclipsed by China and India, and that probably will happen. But to some degree, we have the possibility of helping them to avoid our own course of development. And here, the kind of America First policy that someone like Trump is advancing becomes quite counterproductive. I mean, we're in this together whether we like it or not, right? It's one planet, and we have to be very proactive.
Yes, there's only one lifeboat.
Yeah, I mean, even if Elon Musk wants us to go to Mars, I don't think we're going to be able to get there fast enough to.
Yes, with enough people to make any difference. Yes.
So I think one of the important parts of foreign policy has to do with dealing with climate change and ensuring that the world really puts a cap on all new fossil fuel development, and instead make sure that any expansion in any energy production is green. And it can be done, but it's going to take, on the one hand, decisive national measures by the countries who are the greatest energy producers and consumers, and international initiatives. And I think those are crucial matters.
What would you do about the trade treaties that the Trump administration is continuing to negotiate?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the push towards free trade, open trade, which is to some degree an extension of neoliberalism, is problematic because it clearly can have bad consequences for all parties involved. Right?
Yes, but also it's not really free trade. It certainly doesn't fit a Smithian model.
Yeah.
Okay, it's managed trade, and it seems to be trade which is designed to protect the corporations against all other interests they might encounter in the context of trade. So what would you do about that in relation to how you would handle trade issues and about trade treaties that might arise?
I mean, you can take the example of NAFTA, for example, and what it has done to our part of the world. It clearly, on the one hand, has led to much of our immigration crisis, because it is, we have dumped a lot of agriculture, very productively produced agricultural produce, much of it being corn that is not particularly good for anyone's health.
Yes.
Transforming the diets of people in Latin America, and at the same time destroying much of the native agriculture and pauperizing large parts of the peasantry.
Yes.
We have nowhere to keep the livelihood than north of the border. And on the other hand, it also has involved setting up of manufacturing plants in Mexico near our border that to some degree have lost a certain amount of jobs from our manufacturing sector, but have also led many peasants from Mexico to swarm to those border regions where they find there isn't enough work to go around. Of course, the working conditions and pay are nothing in comparison to what they are in the United States. And so it has also dislocated much of Mexican and Latin American society, and has not certainly not benefited everyone in the United States, to say the least. We want to have trade policies that can be mutually beneficial, that can raise the living standards of all people concerned, that can raise the labor standards of everyone involved, and try to negotiate some respect for doing that as a condition for doing international trade. And negotiating it in a way so that it is going to be as beneficial as possible to the countries involved. and not to take a very rapacious America First attitude, which of course translates into certain corporations coming first. And of course, part of international trade is, of course, illegal trade.
Yes.
And our war on drugs is in some respect a matter of international commerce, because what we've done by refusing to legalize the personal consumption of drugs in the biggest market for the consumption of drugs is to unleash these drug cartels that are
criminal gangs,
sort of producing an epidemic of criminality and terror that are driving people once again north of the border, and all of this could be wiped out if we were to legalize personal consumption, if we were to offer the drugs in a legal way, together with all the medical care that people need if it is a problem. And that would have a large impact upon international relations. The Taliban, for example, would have to find another way to fund itself in growing poverty. And it has many worldwide implications. And after all, this is a very significant part of world commerce.
Yes, and it's a significant part of the terrorism problem.
Yeah.
Of course. Okay, one of the things that I often think about is the idea of public purpose, which is an abstraction, and a composite with many dimensions. And the reason why I think about it, in part, is because of my interest in economics, and in fiscal policy, and the modern money theory approach to fiscal policy.
Yeah.
When I began to think more broadly about the public purpose, and beyond the ideas of simply full employment and stability in prices, I found myself confronted with a multiplicity of aspects, of public purpose. I began to wonder, why don't we look at our foreign policy and our trade policy also from the viewpoint of the public purpose, and why don't we also at the same time integrate both the national spheres and the international spheres through public purpose as an idea, and ask the question, when we approach our trading policies, are these policies really consistent with the public purpose, and not simply the public purpose in international terms, but the dimensions of public purpose which relate to our national political and economic systems as well. And so I wondered what you thought about that. One of the reasons why I'm curious about it is because I wrote an ebook about it. So I have kind of an abiding interest in this area. Anyway, how does that idea strike you?
Well, the question of public purpose gets very complicated in international relations.
It is.
For example, the contrast of multinational corporations, which really are national. The question of what nation they really belong to may become ultimately a matter of indifference. And then you have, to some degree, by contrast, the situation of the employees and the nature of their organizations, which tend to be usually more national in scope and
Indeed.
have limitations built into them because of that. It's very hard for national unions to be able to contend with the global power and opportunities of multinational corporations and hold their own. And it's, in some respect, much more difficult to wield the kind of international labor force or labor union that can really deal with these situations. And that also bears upon the issue of, well, what if we wanted to do something that I'm proposing, which of course has been done in other countries, particularly in Northern Europe, where we ask that the boards of directors of corporations have a fair share of employees on them.
Yes.
I would say at least half. Now, what complicates matters is that when you think of that, one ordinarily thinks of the board of directors being somehow located in a particular nation. So we're talking about the elected representatives of the employees in that nation on the corporate board. But when we're dealing with a multinational corporation, the plot thickens.
It certainly does.
The corporation has its bastions in many parts of the world. And if one really wants to, in some respect, even the playing field between employer and employee, then we're talking about having representation of employees wherever that corporation is based and having them sitting on corporate boards, which of course is going to alter what the corporations do, I think, in a significant way. And that's one way of thinking about regulating them from within with respect to a certain kind of public purpose, the public purpose being that we don't want one particular economic interest to
yes, of course,
preeminent at the expense of all others.
Very true.
Of course, when you deal with regulating these corporations, again, that we face that same difficulty, that we can impose national regulations. And indeed, our power to do so, I think, is something that makes so-called neo-colonialism not something equivalent to colonialism. In other words, when a nation becomes independent, or when a former colony becomes independent, of course, it may still be under the domination of foreign economic interests. But the fact that it has become independent gives it certain possibilities that give it a certain room for maneuver. Of course, it of course may be limited if the foreign corporate power is able to influence the political process, which of course it may very well strive to do so in all sorts of ways. But nonetheless, nations do have, independent nation has certain resources. It can, in some respect, control its trade, regulate its trade. It can also have its own independent monetary policy. You see the difficulties of countries in the European Union when they gave up that option, Greece being a prime example. And
well, of course, it was the problem, of monetary policy and having that somewhere else. But in addition, as a result of that being somewhere else, also fiscal policy was somewhere else, as well, because they no longer had the fiscal policy space to run the deficits that a monetary sovereign can run. So that was a problem. But a little further, what I wondered about was this, when we debate our trading policies, we frequently do it in terms of certain concepts, like the free trade concept. We want such and such a treaty because it's going to promote free trade. And free trade is best. Because of Smith. And Ricardo. And their theories. And then there's the managed trade idea. And then there's also the balanced trade idea. The Warren Buffett proposal for balanced trade. And then there's also fair trade. And there are different notions, of fair trade. Some notions that focus on the difference between the developing nations, and the developed nations. And some notions that focus on not actually trading for products that are produced in a way that exploits people who produce these products. So those are the two distinct notions, okay, of fair trade, okay? And so then we also have the standard we just have been talking about, which is the about public purpose standard. Now, I've never heard any people really debating trading policy by asking the question, well, is this policy really in accord with the public purpose of the United States, okay, or another country, okay, or with each country? Is the public purpose for each country that's a party to a treaty really served by that particular treaty? I don't see anybody actually asking that question. So I guess I'd like you to comment on that.
No, I think that is the key question to ask, right? I mean, the trade as well as economic activity in general has to be something that is going to serve a public purpose, which involves not just questions of economic enrichment of either certain groups or everyone, but it also has to do with the functioning of the body politic and the political process.
Right, and it also has to do with serving the cultures of the different countries
and families.
well. Yes,
so
and families.
With regard to culture, I think it's, various nations have good reason to try to impose restrictions on domination by foreign, let's say, cultures or entertainment industries, and to present certain kinds of trade barriers that are going to enable them to have their own independent cultural flowering, be it in the film business, music business, or whatever, right? Because it's too easy for a Hollywood or a Bollywood to completely destroy any kind of indigenous cultural flowering. And that is important to the independence of nations, and in truer sense. And that clearly is one could say a reasonable aim of trade policy, to allow nations to have independent cultures and a flowering of their own various arts.
Okay, so let me ask you a leading question,
Yeah.
okay, of a sort.
Yeah.
You're obviously knowledgeable, extremely knowledgeable about our foreign affairs, okay, and foreign policy, and you have some very well worked out opinions in those areas, which I think a characteristic of the deep thought you obviously put into quite a few subjects. Okay, but my leading question, okay, is this. Why haven't you been expressing your foreign policy ideas and your foreign policy agenda on your website, okay, and in other places where people can see it?
I mean, I sort of haven't put it out there because, in some respect, the primary focus of the campaign is to raise what I think are the, in a way, the more immediate failings of our domestic situation that have been largely ignored. Whereas I think the foreign policy issues I'm speaking about are not so entirely absent from aspects of our discussion, although to some degree I have things to say about them. But in a way, I think that in the House of Representatives, one is not at the forefront of matters concerning foreign policy. One is with respect to the funding of various things, but it's the Senate that really has more to say.
But it seems to me it's fairly important, though, for people to know that you're squarely in the camp of doing something to change our foreign policy and making it a less dangerous one from the viewpoint of conflict, also from the viewpoint of trade,
Yeah.
Okay, and also from the viewpoint of harm to the environment.
Yeah.
You're very different from most of the candidates who are running for Congress on these kinds of of matters, and so it seems to me that people ought to know that.
I think you're right, and to some degree, I think this is something that will come out more if and when I make it beyond the primary, because I think it's really in confronting my Republican opponent that these issues are going to be raised. Because
yes, I think that's probably true.
Going to be speaking about
it. Most important in the general.
Yeah, we'll bring up the military, and by that time, I will have to begin talking about these things.
Okay, so to shift our discussion in the last a few minutes we have, okay, because I have to be prompt, okay, in getting off here today.
Sure.
I have a following live stream at 10:10 that I have to get ready for. That I didn't expect to have, but it fell on me, and I had to pitch in, okay, and take it. However, what I wanted to ask you about is, what is the state of the campaign now in your district? What is your competition like, and what are the positions, okay, that they are taking?
Well, I have currently one Democratic opponent who I'm facing in the primary. It's not impossible that someone else may enter. The actual qualifying week where candidates have to register at the state capitol is the first week of March. So it's possible that someone might jump in. I'm not expecting it, but it's possible. My opponent is someone who basically is offering the Democratic Party platform.
Okay, so is your opponent someone who has the support of the establishment, quote unquote?
Well, I mean,
at this point,
the establishment, quote unquote, in my district, where Georgia is a very weak entity.
Oh, good.
It's also an entity that is not really going to officially endorse anyone until the primary is over. So individuals in it may be driving to it. My opponent presents herself as someone who is more electable in the sense that she stresses for being a Christian, for being someone from a small town, having grown up in Georgia, having a family that's been there for a long time. And these sort of things being important elements in providing a path to victory against Jody Heiss, who's the incumbent, who is himself a former radio evangelist. But, I don't think that really makes much sense. After all, Donald Trump is the person who won almost 2/3 of the vote of my district, and he had no real evangelical credentials to flaunt. He wasn't a small town boy. He's not a guy from Queens like me. And he was speaking about the economic anxieties of the voters of the district, raising scapegoats as sources of that economic difficulty, and claiming that he will bring jobs to America, manufacturing back to America. So I think if one presents the real answers to these kind of problems, then one has a real path to victory.
Okay.
And the answers are ones that the Democrats once put forward back in the days of Roosevelt's last term, but they've sort of been forgotten. But I think now's the time to revive many of these ideas, particularly.
Yes, and of course, I quite agree. I'm always involved in reviving these ideas.
Yeah. And the point is, it's easy to show that they are realizable. So that's the task of my campaign. And, one of the great problems candidates face in a place where I am, where we're outside any major media market, is being able to present the arguments to a large part of the voting public. I mean, how do you get out to them? How do you have an opportunity to actually engage in a meaningful political debate? it'd be nice if there were shows like this or discussions like this that a lot of the electorate was actually looking at. But the TV that people watch has nothing to do with local politics in our area. It's coming out of the metro areas that are outside of our district, namely Atlanta in particular. And the print media have dried up. Many people are not on social media. So that's one of the big challenges. So my campaign is at the point where I'm trying to go around where I can. Of course, unfortunately, I have to spend a lot of time trying to raise money. I mean, if we had reasonable campaign finance reform, where the government provided resources for every candidate to put out their message in an argued way that every voter would have access to, one wouldn't need to raise money.
Yes.
It would be a completely different kind of political discussion. Sound bites would not be of significance. Twitter,
Okay. And that would be wonderful.
Political, where politics takes place in any fashion. So, but unfortunately, we have to contend with that in the present moment.
Yes, we do. Okay, so I regret to say that I have to end this, in just a few minutes. What I'd like to do, though, is to offer you the opportunity of a platform. When you feel you'd like to come on, to communicate a message to your constituents from here, then I would be happy to bring you on again for another conversation.
I'd be very happy to.
I think that your candidacy is a very important one for the progressive movement. And I, for one, would really like to see you win.
Well, thank you.
So you persuaded me.
Okay. Well, I hope that any of your viewers who are also persuaded that they'll look up my candidacy. I have a campaign website, winfieldforcongress.com. Alas, I need contributions, financial as well as manpower. But I hope that people will pay attention to what's going down here. And I hope that the ideas I'm putting forward will be taken up elsewhere by other candidates.
Yes, I hope so too. Are you in contact yet with Victor Tiffany and the contract for an American renewal, CFAR?
I've looked at the website, but I haven't made contact.
Okay.
I referred to it.
Okay, I have asked him to make contact with you because it seems to me you would fit that, extremely well, and that it would bring you into contact with other candidates as well across the country, so that it's good from that point of view. Okay, to my viewers, I want to say also that although I have to get off here, I'll be on again, at 10:10 with a congressional candidate from the Las Vegas area, Richard Hart. And he is also billed as a progressive, and he's going to talk about his platform, and we'll see what he has to say. So I'll be available in just a few minutes for that. And in the meantime, please don't forget my Patreon account and the Real Progressives Patreon account. Also, we exist only with your help, as does the whole progressive effort. So thank you very much. And I'll be ending this broadcast now. And thank you, Richard, but once again, for many good conversations.
And thank you very much for having the kind of extended conversations that is so important to a real democracy.
Well, you are very welcome. I revel in these conversations.
Well, I hope we can do it again at some point down the line.
I'm sure.